Good morning, everybody. We would like to start the meeting. If everybody can sit down. Our people this morning already working quite hard in the contact group and also yesterday evening. So I think that's good that progress has been made. So I would like to start with reporting back from the contact groups. I would like to start with replenishment. So could Mexico or Belgium report back on the status? I think Mexico. Sergio, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I'm glad to report that despite our urge last night to get dinner, we got a good progress on our contact group, and we started putting together a list of ideas, requests, comments, and suggestions to the RTF in order to improve the report. The current version of this first list is already posted on the meeting portal, but we would like to request for more time to keep on working in the contact group. Thank you.
Thank you. And indeed, let's say the items are already on the portal available, and there will be time made available for a next meeting and to be announced later. Thank you. Then I would like to go to the contact on the terms of reference. Leslie Grenada or the USA, who will report back. I see Leslie Grenada. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair, and indeed I am very happy and privileged to report on the outcome of the contact group on the TOR for the quad assessment. We are privileged to have an early meeting this morning, our second meeting of the contact group, and there has been very good progress within the group. As a matter of fact, we started looking at the text of the CRP and started making some adjustments and review of that, so there has been very good progress thus far. But having said that, obviously we would require much more time to complete our work, and we're hoping that you may be able to find some time at this meeting for us to continue our work and to see how much more progress that can be made. So we thank all the members for their contribution, and we look forward to your cooperation in providing us some additional time to advance our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you on providing the plenary with information on the progress. As everybody is aware that the contact group and the replenishment is the one that really has to come up with, let's see, the element of the supplementary report. We try to fit in, let's say, a third meeting also for the contact group in terms of reference. But it's not a promise yet. Also depends what time we end the plenary. But we do our best, and if there's time available, you will have a slot allotted for next meeting. So a little bit cautious on that because we have still a lot of items on the plenary agenda. Then, and thank you for all the good work. Then the contact group on the proposed adjustment, who will report back. I just have to look at the right, and they're almost at the same row. Argentina, Juan.
Efectivamente, en el día de ayer tuvimos oportunidad de reunirnos en el grupo de contacto para tratar la propuesta de CRP presentada por la delegación de Cuba. Pudimos lograr un avance significativo en términos de entender los puntos de vista de todos los países que participaron del grupo de contacto y ciertamente creo que estamos logrando avances, pero igualmente requeriríamos algún espacio extra que entiendo que tendremos lugar hoy al mediodía para poder seguir trabajando, fundamentalmente para afrontar dos de los desafíos que tiene por delante el grupo. Uno es encontrar una medida que permita dar certeza de quiénes efectivamente van a lograr poder tener este beneficio en el caso de que se apruebe, y segundo, resolver el tema de la falta de datos en algunos países para poder evaluar unos posibles escenarios. Así que con suerte hoy al mediodía podremos lograr más avances. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you for reporting back on the group on the adjustment and the progress you made. And because it was the first meeting, indeed, there will be a second meeting possible later this day. So thank you for the good work. And then I would like to go to one item where there was a CRP under 3G, where that was put forward by Canada and several other parties. There was yesterday no agreement on, let's say, establishing a group, yes or not, but there was the idea to have some more informal discussions, and I understood there were some new developments. So if Canada could enlighten us with that.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Good morning, colleagues. Yes, we spoke informally to a number of delegations that expressed concerns yesterday, maybe not all of them, but and we understand that they would be open if there's time still this week, and we realize it's a busy schedule, so we're in your hands, but if there is time to have a 1-hour informal discussion on this issue, it doesn't need to be specific consideration of the CRP, but consideration of short-lived substances and DCM. And should there not be time, I mean, we would really appreciate to have this discussion so we could address some of the broader concerns that have been raised about this issue. Otherwise, I guess there's no objection to forward this CRP to the MOP, and we would consider it more specifically at the meeting of the parties. Thank you.
Thank you, Canada, by providing us with this new information. So I assume if there's agreement with the other parties you consulted, we see if possible, time allows, then to have a meeting. And I see India requesting for the floor. India.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and good morning to all. What we can consider here is that we could have a general exchange of ideas, and in an informal setting the discussions could happen, but not on the CRP as such. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there other parties requesting the floor on this issue? So I think it's clear. We will, if possible, and we look into and it depends also what time the plenary, of course, ends. If possible, we then have, we could have an informal group, but then not specifically on the CRP, but it's really depending also on the time. We have still a lot of issues on the agenda, and if we close early, there is more time available to have some more groups, and otherwise we have to slim down a little bit. Okay, if that's all, we can continue with agenda item 7B, where we stopped yesterday. And I already would like to ask the team to come forward. Yes, team, please. Last year at the MOP, decision 34/5, parties requested TEEP to prepare a report on chemical pathways, gaps in understanding of the emissions, best practices, and the TEEP was requested to present that at this meeting. So, TEEP, if you are available to start the presentation, then please do so. And afterwards, I would like to have questions and also more general statements together. So be prepared for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Co-Chair. As a blessed relief for everybody in the room, and perhaps especially for us up here presenting, this is a very short presentation, so hopefully that helps with the agenda. On behalf of the Medical and Chemical Technical Options Committee and my colleagues up here, Keiichi, Junjun and Nick Campbell as well, it's my pleasure to report on our response to Decision 34/5 on identification of gaps in the global coverage of atmospheric monitoring of controlled substances and options for enhancing such monitoring. Firstly, the decision requested TEEP to prepare a report for the 45th meeting of the Open-Ended Working Group on Chemical Pathways in which substantial emissions of controlled substances are likely, best practices available to control these emissions, and gaps in understanding the sources of those emissions. In its assessment of chemical pathways in which substantial emissions of controlled substances are likely, MCTOC assigned chemical pathways into associated global annual production bands and likely emission rates for related controlled substances. We identified chemical production pathways that are likely able to produce substantial emissions of controlled substances, that is, those having a sufficiently high combination of likely emission rate and annual global production. We considered a reasonable threshold for substantial emissions, as requested by parties, to be global emissions greater than 1,000 tonnes of controlled substances per year from a chemical pathway. "24 chemical pathways are considered by MCTOC likely to have substantial emissions of controlled substances for those substances listed here. I refer you to Table 5.5 in the 2023 TEEP Progress Report and the related matrix showing those pathways with substantial emissions, which is in Figure 5.3. The assessment shows that most production processes will only have substantial emissions of controlled substances when producing controlled substances or using them as feedstocks. Any other controlled substances involved in the process will only be produced and then released in much smaller quantities, which may be negligible. There are a few notable exceptions where chemical pathways are likely able to produce substantial emissions of unwanted byproducts. as opposed to production. HFC 23 bioproduction from chloroform to HCFC 22 chemical pathway. CTC bioproduction from methyl chloride to dichloromethane to chloroform chemical pathway. And CFC 115 bioproduction from perchloroethylene to HFC 125 chemical pathway. There are also chemical pathways with annual emissions of byproducts likely to be on the boundary of substantial emissions used in this assessment. So they don't appear in the table, but they're likely to be on the boundary. HFC 23 bioproduction from dichloromethane to HFC 32, and HFC 23 bioproduction from HCFC 22 pyrolysis to TFE HFP. Next, in response to the next part of the decision, there are a range of best practices available to control emissions of controlled substances arising from production, bioproduction and feedstock use, including optimising plant design, equipment, operation and maintenance, instrumentation and monitoring of process and emissions, training and instruction for plant operators, periodic mass balancing, technologies for destruction or for separation and chemical transformation to treat unwanted co-products or byproducts and abate their emissions, regulatory controls to provide the economic framework to ensure any or all of the above emissions mitigation measures are implemented by operators and to require emissions and other reporting. Next, we're responding to the gaps in our understanding the sources of emissions, and there are many gaps in understanding the sources of emissions from chemical pathways with substantial emissions. The main reasons are the existing gaps in publicly available data, some of which may be unavailable due to commercial confidentiality. As a result, estimations of mean emission rates of controlled substances and annual global production have a high degree of uncertainty. Gaps in understanding the sources of emissions include the following unknowns and uncertainties. Global capacity and production by chemical pathway are not accurately known. Production and feedstock quantities are available for controlled substances under Article 7 reporting, however, might not be available for chemical pathways producing or using non-controlled substances that might emit controlled substances. For most production facilities, actual emissions and global locations are not reported by parties. Average global generation and mean emission rates of controlled substances by different chemical pathways are not accurately known and likely vary over time. While the sources of emissions from chemical pathways and emission rates used in our assessment are likely to be reasonable estimates, they might change over time. And that ends our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Teeb. That's a very brief presentation and very concise with a lot of information. I would like to open the floor for questions and also general comments. Please. I don't see any requests for the floor. So I think India.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We thank for the report as well as for the presentation. We note from the presentation that that there are 24 chemical pathways that has been proposed by MCTOC. And out of that 24 chemical pathways proposed, which are likely to have substantial emissions, are mostly the HFCs. So in the process of HFC phase down, these emissions are likely to be reduced. We also noted that the available best practices, which is there in the report and it was presented also to control the emissions, most of these are standard practices generally complied by chemical manufacturing companies in mostly in most countries, including the large producing countries. There was a matrix presented that showed the chemical pathways in which substantial emissions of controlled substances that are likely based on reported global production and mean emission rate of controlled substance. Of course, we heard partly that it is sufficiently the high combination of likely emission rate and global production. However, we would like to have more understanding on the methodology here adopted. Regarding the gaps in understanding the sources of emissions, we would like to mention here that the data reporting obligations for all controlled substances are met by all the parties. In this context, we feel that the emphasis should be on strengthening capacities of parties, especially the Article 5 parties, wherever needed, on strengthening the national frameworks and systems for such activities. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, India. Are other parties requesting for the floor? I would like to see them now on my list. European Union.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Of course, we have to intervene simply to thank DEEP for this excellent and concise report based on a quite brief decision in the context of the monitoring introduced at the last meeting, but with a content which links with a number of initiatives discussed and presented at this meeting. Therefore, we would reserve a bit how to follow up on this report and to look at it again when we are also having heard and discussed the results from the CTC emission report. Those issues are closely linked. In the part of the report concerning the gaps, we are also touching upon issues we are discussing under the strengthening of the institutions when it comes to reporting and how to make best use of it. So it's interlinked, and for the time being, under this agenda point, we keep it with a big thanks to the panel, and we will further deliberate on the way how to integrate and make the links to other items raised, including the additional points introduced under agenda point 3G. So there will be opportunity to discuss in this context also how to make use of this report in a broader context. Thanks.
I see Kenya and Canada on my list, and I would like to ask other delegations who would like to intervene to appear on the screen, just then to go to DEEP to answer the questions. And I also would like to close the list just to be aware, so please press your button if you would like to intervene, and I see you on the screen. Kenya first.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. This delegation would like to thank TIP for the good presentation. We noted that when TIP was presenting, she actually mentioned that they considered 24 chemical pathways for emissions. And we noticed that after that consideration, they realized that there were actually some pathways that were producing actually much emissions. And we are aware that HFC may be one of them. But this delegation would like to understand clearly which are other pathways that are producing this emission so that we can continue. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last one on the list is Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We also just wanted to thank the TEEP for the information on chemical pathways in its 2023 progress report. We think there's a lot of very interesting analysis and detailed information there that we didn't have before. Like the European Union, we don't see that there's a compelling reason at this stage to follow up on the specific information provided in the context of this agenda item. We believe that the information provided does relate and does bring further context to other agenda items we're considering at this meeting, in particular 7A on the atmospheric monitoring and the item on CTC, as well the issue of feedstock that was raised earlier by Australia. So we think that at this stage, I mean, you know, we can wait until them up, but at this stage, we don't see the need to pursue this as a standalone issue, but to be mindful that it contains information of use under our consideration of other agenda items. We also note the intervention by the distinguished delegate from India about the need to strengthen capacities in Article 5 countries to minimize emissions, ensure accurate monitoring and reporting. And we think that these are issues that, you know, can and should be considered in the assistance that's being provided under the multilateral fund. So in that context, you know, we would continue to be open to consider this issue when projects, either the production sector or in the consumption sector, are considered under the multilateral fund. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I would like to give the floor to Teep to answer several of the questions posed to you. And there were several compliments for the report.
Well, thank you for the compliments. And in terms of responses to the question, so India asked about a greater understanding of the methodology that we used. There's an appendix in the report that kind of provides some detail about, with some examples about how we went about this analysis. And certainly in terms of the estimated global production tonnage bands, for example, we provided bands because the Article 7 reporting is confidential, and we need to be able to disguise some information sometimes. So we put things into production bands to be able to do that and then present the information to parties. So that's why there's a band there. But we actually have the data behind that in being able to make our assessment. But we present it in that way to you. In terms of the estimated mean emission rates, emissions per tonne of production globally, that's based on our experts' expertise and understanding of processes around the globe, and is again provided in a band to take into account the range of potentially different approaches that might be taken globally. But again, you know, we have that detailed information in the background. Sorry. Oh, yes, and also in our assessment report, that on table 2.6, we used emission factors that we had developed for the assessment report. I think it's on page 54 of the assessment report. We go through in quite a lot of detail how we estimate emissions from production processes, which includes losses from the normal chemical plant production, including maintenance, losses when filling drums and tanks and cylinders and containers. And so it goes into those details there in that report. So I refer India to that report as well in terms of our methodology. Then there was a question from Kenya regarding the 24 pathways. Perhaps to clarify, when we did this report, we considered any chemical pathway, because of course we had to look at all chemical pathways that might generate controlled substances as and then them as emissions, because we had to use that as a starting point to then be able to understand those with substantial emissions. So we actually, you know, have a very big spreadsheet with kind of all of that, and then narrowed it down to our threshold that we used for this assessment, which was anything greater than 1,000 tonnes per year globally. So hopefully that clarifies that part of the methodology. Thank you.
Thank you, T, by clarifying. That's the questions. Then I would like to close this agenda item, because there was some, so then we can continue and go to agenda item 8. And I hand over to my co-chair.
Merci beaucoup, Raph. Passons maintenant au point 8 de l'ordre du jour. Avant d'y aller, nous allons permettre au groupe de se retirer et reprendre leur place. Merci beaucoup, aux experts. Je disais tantôt que nous allons passer maintenant au point 8 de l'ordre du jour, portant sur le rapport d'avancement 2023 du GETE. Rappelons que le rapport 2023 du GETE comprend 3 volumes, dont les volumes 1 et 2, qui traitent des informations nécessaires aux discussions sur les 6 sous-paragraphes du point 8 de l'ordre du jour. Ces sous-paragraphes concernent les nominations pour l'exemption pour utilisation critique du bromure de méthyle pour 2024, les émissions continues de tétrachlorure Ces sous-paragraphes concernent les nominations pour l'exemption pour utilisation critique du bromure de méthyle pour 2024, les émissions continues de tétrachlorure de carbone, les utilisations en quarantaine et avant expédition du bromure de méthyle pour lesquelles les alternatives sont disponibles, les problèmes existants et options potentielles pour la configuration et la fonction future des comités des choix techniques du groupe spécial, les modifications de la composition du groupe et les autres questions. Nous allons d'abord suivre une présentation du GETE sur les 2 volumes de son rapport qui sont également affichés sur le portail de la réunion. La note du secrétariat, le document 45/2 et ses addenda, addendum 1 et addendum 2, qui contiennent les résumés des questions à examiner au titre de ce point de l'ordre du jour. Leurs références exactes peuvent être consultées à l'écran. Après la présentation, nous aurons en premier lieu une courte session de questions de réponse et de clarification, puis nous aborderons en second lieu les sous-programmes du point 8 de l'ordre du jour. Ceci signifie que nous allons d'abord suivre une présentation du GETE sur la question, puis nous aurons une session de questions-réponses et nous allons ensuite migrer sur une autre phase de nos travaux qui va concerner maintenant l'examen point par point de chaque sous-paragraphe du point 8. Donc nous allons inviter le GETE à la tribune pour présenter son rapport sur le point 8. Le groupe est en place. Vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the assessment report of the TEEP on behalf of my co-chairs and the entire team. This presentation will focus on TEEP 2023 reports. We will briefly tell you about our activities so far this year. We will then cover the progress report, including the interim CUN report, response to decision 3410 on methylbromide stocks and QPS uses, response to decision 346 on CTC, a brief reference to PFAS, and also a response to decision 3411 on TOC configurations, ending with some comments on TEEP organizational matters. This is our current membership, and again, I would like to take the opportunity to thank our members for their very, very hard work in getting all these reports completed. Since January 2023, TEEP has submitted the FTOC, FSTOC, MEPTOC, MCTOC, and RTOC 2022 assessment reports, followed by the full TEEP 2022 assessment report. In May 2023, we submitted the progress report as volume 1 of this big undertaking. It contains a supplement which refers to the energy efficiency report that we have seen presented already. Volume 2 refers to the interim evaluation of methylbromide critical use nominations. Volume 3 refers to the assessment of the funding requirement for the replenishment of the multilateral fund, that is a response to decision 34.2. And further, we have developed, together with the other panels, the synthesis report. In general, we are pleased to report that TEEP and its TOCs have resumed face-to-face meetings. This really has helped our work. Some hybrid meetings are still taking place, and the TOCs take advantage of virtual facilities to meet, as well as TEEP and especially TEEP co-chairs. RTOC, the Replenishment Task Force, MEPTOC, FSTOC, and MCTOC met during the first semester of 2023 face-to-face, and further meetings are being planned for the rest of the year. TEEP itself met in London in April 2023. The co-chairs of the 3 panels also met in London to prepare their synthesis report. And as a result, TEEP, its TOCs, task force, and working groups have prepared and submitted on time all reports as required by decisions set out by the parties. Firstly, I would like to address the Methylbromide Technical Options Committee reports on behalf of my co-chair, Ian Porter, and myself. Our progress report this year is quite short, given that we just submitted the 2022 assessment report. These are just a few highlights. In first instance, methylbromide has been recommended for inclusion in Annex 3 of the Rotterdam Convention, which allows its 165 signatory parties to follow imports of this substance under their prior informed consent or PIC procedure. This issue will be given further consideration during the meeting of the Chemical Review Committee of the Rotterdam Convention coming up in October this year. Sulfuryl fluoride, which is a key alternative mainly for structures and commodities to methylbromide, and also approved and used in some QPS applications, has been listed under Annex 2 of the proposed F-gas regulation of the EU, mainly owing to its high GWP. If approved, this regulation mandates recapture of SF whenever feasible, and this could restrict its use and increase its costs. Research on alternatives to methylbromide, on a happier note, if I may, continues for QPS uses, and registration of several key alternatives has increased around the world. This includes hydrogen cyanide, ethane dinitrile, ethyl formate, and others. The decline in atmospheric methylbromide concentrations is now solely dependent on future reduction in emissions from QPS. I will now address the CUN interim assessment. MEPTOC received only one application for a critical use in 2024. This is for 3.857 tons from Canada. It represents a 17% reduction from the approved amount at 34 MOP, and MEPTOC is making a full recommendation for this amount. The party reported no stocks at the end of 2022 and indicated a reduction plan to potentially phase out all methylbromide uses or critical use requests by 2026. No A5 parties submitted any CUNs for this period. Now I will address Decision 3410 on stocks and QPS uses of methylbromide. Introducing. The decision invited parties to submit by the 1st June 2023 on a voluntary basis a list of the pests and commodity combinations in which methylbromide is needed and used in the respective countries, and accessible data on the volumes of pre-phase-out stocks of methylbromide at the country level. At the time of finalizing the TEEP progress report, Australia had submitted data in response to this decision. This information had been provided previously in time for the assessment report preparation. Responses from Canada and the US were received by the Secretariat at a later date. The US reported that 50 tons of pre-2005 methylbromide were still available as of 31st December 2016. But since these stocks are privately held, recent data is not accessible publicly under domestic law. With respect to MEPTOC, the decision asked, in consultation with the Secretariat of the IPPC, to provide updated information to the 45th OEWG on current QPS uses for which alternatives are available. In its response, MEPTOC used surveys submitted for the assessment report. The survey showed that many parties did not clearly identify which uses were for quarantine and which for pre-shipment, the latter of which involve non-Q pests. The following confusion often existed with the pre-shipment use category, which is unique to the Montreal Protocol, that is to say, it is not considered under IPPC. Methylbromide treatment for a Q pest was often wrongly described as pre-shipment because it was applied within 21 days before that shipment. Pre-shipment was used very broadly, but should only comprise methylbromide use for non-quarantine pests if under official control by the importing country, and only for an exporting country if an official regulation existed before 7 December 1995. A review of pre-shipment uses by countries may identify situations where methylbromide should not be used and consequently considered under the CUN exception process or phase-out. I now give the floor to my co-chair, Ian Porter, to address our response to this decision fully. Thank you.
In order for MEPTOC to respond, it couldn't do it with the surveys that were submitted because they were put in after we did our progress report. So we needed to use formal data or any other surveys that received prior to that point. Using those surveys, we could categorise the use of methylbromide, and that is important to do because unless you know the categories, you won't know whether they're quarantine or pre-shipment, and therefore what alternatives are available for those uses. This slide shows you the categories broken down for over the last 5 years since the assessment reports in 2018 and 2022. And at the bottom of the diagram, you can see that in the green, the blue and the yellow, that's about 50% of the uses, which is in logs, wood and wood packaging material. So therefore an alternative for those uses could address 50% of quarantine and pre-shipment uses in total. The next few slides are in the report and there's a fair bit of detail in them, and we ask you to refer to the report to see examples of situations which satisfy quarantine and those which satisfy pre-shipment. In the quarantine case, the commodities you can see on the left there are just a few examples. Generally, parties will specify and always specify a quarantine pest. There's no argument. It's a quarantine situation. For pre-shipment, however, within 21 days of export, Marta's already told you there is a lot of confusion. The commodities on the left could be wheat grain or empty ship holds. The pests aren't quarantine pests. They're endemic pests, common pests that occur in countries all over the world. There's a regulation that requires methylbromide use, which is needed either before December 1995 for exporting countries, or if there's an official regulation from the importing country. We had in some of the survey data that's been presented to date information which showed that it satisfied neither quarantine nor pre-shipment, as there's no quarantine pest put forward and there was no official regulation provided. And as Marta said, we're asking parties to review those situations. In order to do that, we've also updated the flowchart that's been provided regularly for the QPS determination of quarantine and pre-shipment uses, and that flowchart is in the report, and it'll assist parties determine which categories their use falls into. In putting all that together, we were then able to put forward a number of alternatives for both quarantine and more so the pre-shipment uses in the report. It's too detailed here to go through it in the time available, but you'll see on the right in bold a number of treatments listed there which can be used and are registered and are available in certain regions of the world for uses for both quarantine and pre-shipment, and in some cases they're the preferred alternative to methyl bromide. We were asked to liaise with the IPPC, which we did, and we also always look at the ISPMs, the International Standards for Phytosanitary Measures, which list alternatives that can be used for quarantine only. They don't tackle pre-shipment. It's unique to the protocol. So just to improve the adoption of alternatives, QPS alternatives, we suggest to parties that there's consistent differentiation given between quarantine and the endemic pests, the common pests that occur in pre-shipment. There's acceptance of efficacy levels below the default Provat 9, certainly in the pre-shipment situation. There's increasing registration of alternatives for different regions, continuing reviewing trade partner approvals and implementing the IPPC accepted alternatives that are listed in the ISPMs, and then trials or demonstrations and information exchange to build confidence in the alternatives. These should be coupled with training on safe handling of chemicals, management, prevention of residues and others. I now forward on to Helen Terranoni to give the STOC review. Sorry.
Thank you, Ian. Can I use the advancer? Thank you.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. For myself and my co-chair, Paolo Atoy, thank you for letting me give this update. This will be brief because we've just completed the assessment report. So just to point out again that generally transitions to non-ozone depleting substances and low global warming potential alternatives have been successful and continue to move forward. Of course, there is no single drop-in foam blowing agent replacement for currently used HCFCs or hydrofluorocarbons HFCs. There are different technical, economic, safety, and environmental performance properties for each low GWP, zero ODP alternative, and different needs for each market subsector. There is a proliferation of blends across the whole of the foam sector, which is an indication of the reality that there is no single best solution. Again, we point out that technical and economic challenges remain for some sectors and small and medium enterprises. The price of HFC blowing agents has risen substantively and is nearly as high as hydrofluoroolefins and hydrochlorofluoroolefin prices, so HFOs and HCFCO prices in some parties, and it's especially challenging for small and medium enterprises. Okay, that's not great. In addition, I wanted to talk a little bit about the capacity and supply-demand challenges. Newly announced low global warming potential foam blowing agent capacity has eased the shortage of supply and cost and the cost of alternatives, especially cyclopentane and HFOs. Additional capacity required to alleviate the shortage suggests that there was an insufficiency of capacity to meet regulated needs for low GWP foam blowing agents, FBAs. We note that HFC 365 manufacture will cease in 2023 after some resource investment by foam manufacturers to convert. Insufficient capacity to meet regulatory mandates is likely to recur without intervention, and patents have restricted options to address local supply chains. Finally, just quickly to comment a little further around energy efficiency challenges and opportunities, there continues to be a trend away from the use of fluorocarbon foam blowing agents with every transition. As the phase outs and phase down progress, there will be limited availability and increasing prices, which will drive the selection of alternatives. It has been estimated that less than 20% of the FBA volume will be comprised of fluorochemicals after the transition to low GWP foam blowing agents globally, in part due to direct conversions to other alternatives, and in part as a result of the use of blends with lower concentrations of fluorocarbons. In parties without standards related to minimum thermal performance requirements, optimizing foam costs could result in higher energy consumption for buildings and refrigerating equipment. With that, I turn this over to Adam Chataway to discuss the FS Talk update.
Distinguished delegates, good morning. It's my pleasure to present the FS Talk progress report on behalf of my co-chairs, Sergei Kopylov and Dan Vodonik. Like several other talks, we've had very little information since we published our assessment report, so we're taking this opportunity to highlight the two biggest issues facing our committee. These are the run-out date for Halon 1301 and emissions of Halon 1301. And as you'll see, these two issues are very tightly interlinked. As we've discussed earlier in this meeting already, the Halon 1301 run-out date range continues to move earlier, and that's illustrated in the graph on the right. The yellow line is the best case run-out date, axis on the right. The blue line is the worst case run-out date, axis on the right. And the two bars are the total bank of Halon 1301, and the grey line is the available bank. And if you look at the slopes of those bars, you'll see that the available bank is being depleted faster than the total bank. Why is this? We believe that it's due to the enduring uses not transitioning to alternatives. After all, they are enduring uses. And they're also, therefore, consuming more of the available bank, making it unavailable. A couple of examples of this. Aircraft are still being built today that will require Halon 1301 in their engines and their cargo compartments for the rest of their lives. Aircraft have an operational life, maybe 30 years, so that's well into the future. In addition, certain military platforms are being upgraded and receiving life extensions, which will take them well into the future. So where does this leave enduring uses and the availability of Halon in the future? One other thing that could exacerbate this situation, and we don't really know this yet, but the emerging PFAS policies are influencing Halon transition to alternatives. Turning to emissions, we've discussed this again already, but here's a graph to help you visualize it. There are two ways of calculating emissions. One is deriving emissions from atmospheric measurements, which is the blue line on this graph, and the other is the FS-TOC model based on reported production and estimating emissions over time. And as you'll see quite clearly, in recent years there's been a considerable divergence, i.e. an increase in the measured emissions over what we would expect. If you integrate that, the difference between those two lines, I get about 4,600 tonnes of Halon 1301 that has been emitted over and above what the FS-TOC model would predict. That's about half of the available bank, which doesn't really seem right. So we think that some of these emissions could be due to production, for example, for feedstock, and we know that it's made for an insecticide called fipronil. What we would really, really like is more detail on production from feedstock, emissions, regional emissions, etc., to get a better handle on where the bank really is, and which will then in turn inform a better run-out date for Halon 1301. Thank you. I now turn over to Helen Tope for the MC talk. Thank you.
Too many things to press. Thank you. So firstly, in presenting the MCTOC 2023 progress report, in 2021, total ODS production and import reported for feedstock uses was 1.8 million tonnes, a significant increase from 2020, and an increase of about 50% over the last decade. The largest reported HFC feedstock is HFC 152A, which is in the thousands of tonnes. The progress report elaborates further on challenges described in the 2022 assessment report on metered dose inhalers and issues that could emerge in transition from high GWP propellant metered dose inhalers to inhalers with lower GWPs, especially with continued supply of technical and pharmaceutical grade HFC 134A and HFC 227EA used as propellants. These and other market-based challenges and uncertainties within the context of the HFC phase-down reinforce the need for a well-planned transition to ensure patients do not face critical shortages or price increases that make metered dose inhalers unaffordable. So we have a couple of slides, extra slides on this topic, with a particular focus on Article 5 parties. As global HFC production diminishes, MDI manufacturers, including in Article 5 parties, may find bulk pharmaceutical grade high GWP propellant sourced from the United Kingdom increasingly difficult to obtain, and cost will increase. These metered dose inhaler manufacturers may have to switch to pharmaceutical grade propellant currently available in India or China. Gaining qualification, however, for an alternative propellant source takes months to years. For MDI manufacturers in Article 5 parties that export to non-Article 5 parties, a switch of propellant manufacturer requires additional studies to gain MDI regulatory approval, which would take time and could impact the continued supply of these MDIs to non-Article 5 markets. We wanted to note that there will be incremental costs for MDI manufacturers in Article 5 parties in the transition from high GWP MDIs to MDIs with lower GWP propellants that parties may need to consider. Sorry. This final slide on MDIs is related to the supply issues, where there are two options that are possible for provision of pharmaceutical grade propellant in future years if technical grade feedstock plants can no longer supply HFC 134A just in time, meaning supply to meet immediate needs. Pharmaceutical grade HFC, meaning, and in this case both 134A and 227EA, could be produced in earlier years and stored in a way that retains its purity and medical status. Technical grade HFC could be stockpiled and later converted to pharmaceutical grade by passing it through a medical purifier plant. Planning for both, however, would be challenging, very challenging, considering cost, regulatory and practical issues. So there is a risk that insufficient time may already be left between when decisions are made to build stock and when technical grade HFC manufacturing assets may shut down, so that stock building may become impractical. This slide is our response to Decision 34.6 on ongoing emissions of CTC, which are invited parties voluntarily that have production of carbon tetrachloride to provide to the Ozone Secretariat on a voluntary basis by 1st of February this year information on national procedures and frameworks in place for the management of production activities in their respective countries. The Secretariat was asked to share that information with the TEEP, and then the TEEP was asked to review that information received and present the information in the progress report and here. In response to that decision, information was submitted by 5 parties: China, the EU, Japan, the UK, and the United States. Different approaches were taken by submitting parties to the information that was provided, with different aspects of their different frameworks highlighted in different ways. Lots of differences there. Some submissions were detailed, while some were summarised. So the MCTOC provided in the progress report a generic summary of the information that was provided in the submissions, identifying similar elements of national procedures and frameworks that have been established by the sample of parties that made submissions. A non-exhaustive list of national procedures and frameworks taken from the submissions is included in the report on page 58. And with that, I will pass to Fabio Pollinara for our talk.
Thank you, Ellen. Good morning, distinguished delegates. Also on behalf of my fellow co-chair Omar Abdelaziz and Roberto Peixoto, here is a very quick update of the refrigeration, air conditioning and heat pumps talk. Considering that the 2022 HARTOC assessment report was released at the end of February 2023, we said that no compelling new information on the technology is available since then, so you can refer to the assessment report for the state of the art of the technology. After the release of the assessment report, we started the process of appointing the new members for the next 2 years in order to comply with current commitments and new challenges that we will be called to in front. And at current, the HARTOC consists of 43 members. 33 members are men, 10 are female, in order to comply with the gender requirements. 26 are renomination from the old committee, and 17 are new members that will be part of our work. 22 members are from non-A5 parties, and 20 members are from A5 parties. Let me conclude by emphasizing the contribution of HARTOC to the Energy Efficiency Working Group. You have heard yesterday about the conclusion of the work of the Working Group on Energy Efficiency, and we are proud to say that 15 members of HARTOC participated in the work of the Energy Efficiency Working Group. Just as a last information, the report of the working group about decision 24.3 is can be found as a supplement of the progress report we are just presenting now. So I conclude this, and I hand the floor to TIP co-chair Bella Maranian for the third part of the presentation.
Great, thank you very much. So I will present on some remaining issues that were covered in our 2020-23 it's been a long week. 2023 progress report. for the information of parties. So this provides some information for parties, knowing that we're following these issues very closely related to emerging policies and information related to PFAS. So we're aware, certainly, that there's increasing focus on the use, emissions, and environmental and health effects of PFAS. We also know that there are ongoing regional, national, and subnational actions related to PFAS that may or may not restrict products using chemicals controlled under the Montreal Protocol, as well as their substitutes and breakdown products such as TFA. We recognize that this is creating uncertainty for industry regarding the long-term availability of certain alternatives to ozone-depleting substances and HFCs. And we're aware, in monitoring the situation, that these could have unintended impacts, potentially, as an example, delaying the phase-out of ODS and the phase-down of HFCs. PFAS have been defined differently by national and sub-national jurisdictions. As an example, we are aware of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development definition would include, the proposed definition would include controlled substances under the Montreal Protocol, including most HFCs, HFOs, and TFA. As another example, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has a working definition of PFAS that excludes most, if not all, of these same substances. There is the situation in the U.S. of states as well considering or enacting policies on PFAS with definitions and scope that could also include substances controlled under the Montreal Protocol. With regard to proposed restrictions under developing and emerging regulations in Europe, the European Chemical Agency, or ECHA, proposes bans which would go into force 18 months that may allow for some exceptions for a limited period of time, sort of restrictions, but would allow some exceptions. Some of the examples of the proposed derogations that we're aware of apply to the fluorinated gases, include the maintenance and refilling of existing heating, ventilation, and air conditioning and refrigeration equipment, the same equipment in buildings, and refrigerants used in mobile air conditioning as examples of some proposed derogations under that regulation. In the US, the EPA is evaluating priority groups of PFAS under their PFAS strategic roadmap. There's also, in the US, states under state regulations, states that have enacted bans for some of these controlled substances that go into effect 2030 and beyond. The same opportunity for potential exceptions. Canada has initiated a rulemaking considering the OECD definition. And we're also aware that in some jurisdictions, such as China and Japan, they restrict certain PFAS under the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. In our report, we share some considerations under a potential broad-ranging definition of PFAS and what this could potentially mean for some of the sectors. In fire suppression, there are low GWP alternatives, 2-BTP, FK5112, that could be considered PFAS, but that all halons, CF3I, and the high GWP HFC23 would not be considered PFAS. This will affect civil aviation's replacement of halon 1211, planned with 2-BTP. For foams under this potential definition and possible restrictions, HFO and HCFO alternatives would be considered PFAS, with uncertainty delaying potential selection. For pressurized metered dose inhalers, HFC 134A, 227EA, and potential alternative HFO 1234ZEE would be considered PFAS, with impact on global supply, affordability, and accessibility of current propellants. And there are other specialized uses that could have limited, if any, lower GWP options, relegating them to only high GWP alternatives, for example, in electronics manufacturing, magnesium production, and precision cleaning for aerospace and military uses. In the refrigeration, air conditioning, and heat pump sector, potential broad-ranging definitions and associated restrictions. We know that most current and low GWP alternative fluorinated refrigerants, except for 5, including HFC 32, would be considered PFAS. These include refrigerants such as HFC 134A, R404A, R410A, and all HFOs. A potential broad-ranging PFAS restriction could affect the uptake of these low GWP alternatives, energy efficiency of some of the medium-sized systems, and the adoption of decarbonizing heat pumps. We also note that most of the fluoropolymers used as flexible seals in compressors, valves, and other components would also fall within this OEC definition of PFAS. We note that this affects not just the refrigeration, air conditioning, and heat pump, but also other sectors. In our progress report, changing gears, we also provided a response to Decision 3411, which asked the TEEP, in consultation with its TOCs, to provide further information on existing challenges and options for future configuration and function of its TOCs. In response to this decision, TEEP had several considerations. It anticipated that its workload would continue at the high level that it has in the past several years. Then, in addition to the yearly requests for technical and economic information, TEEP and its TOCs have several outstanding requirements for annual, triennial, quadrennial, quintennial analyses and reports for ODS phase-out, HFC phase-down, and alternatives, destruction, process agents, continuing on with this list. TEEP has, as in the past, and will continue to do in the future, organized its work and its activities to meet all of these current and emerging technical and economic assessment needs of the parties. Our TOC co-chairs, we rely on them to continually review their membership and ensure that they have the expertise needed to do their work, to provide parties with the latest information, and be able to respond to additional specific party requests. So in our progress report, we outlined a proposal for the TOCs. We propose to maintain the current structure of the 5 TOCs. We focused, considering the workload and the focus, particularly in the refrigeration, air conditioning, and heat pump sector, that the RTOC would continue as a single body, but now primarily organized around 2 very specific areas, the cold chain and space heating and cooling. To manage this workload, we proposed a 4th RTOC co-chair, so we would have a balanced leadership of 2 A5 and 2 non-A5 co-chairs to manage and lead this work focused on these very broad areas. The RTOC would continue to meet in one location, holding separate breakout groups within these 2 big areas, producing a single consensus report. The co-chairs would be relied on to manage the work across the cross-cutting issues of these 2 groups, in addition to coordinating and collaborating as needed with the other TOCs. And finally, in our progress report, we point out some other organizational matters important to the TEEP. We point to parties the end of some of our members' terms in 2 of our committees, as well as all of our senior experts. Just to note that our senior experts have a very important role in the TEEP, providing expertise not currently covered by the other members of the panel, including TEEP and TOC co-chairs. We've identified these needs, as well as the needs for experts on the TOCs, in the annex of our progress report. With that, I conclude our presentation. Thank you very much.
de suivre avec grand intérêt le GETE. Nous remercions le groupe pour cette excellente présentation et pour avoir travaillé d'arrache-pied sur les différents rapports qui ont été présentés tout au long de cette réunion. Nous allons prier le groupe de rester avec nous pour une session de questions-réponses. Sur ce, je voudrais dire que cette session de questions-réponses va concerner et les observations d'ordre général et des questions proprement dites. J'ouvre la session. La parole circule. Sur la liste, il y a les partis qui se manifestent. L'Union européenne. Je vous en prie, l'Union européenne, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. This is a legacy request for the floor because that was we pushed the button just after the closure of the previous agenda point, and there we had the question: which agenda point was actually closed? Was it related to the entire agenda point 7, or simply agenda point 7b? That would have been our understanding, and I see nodding, and with that, thank you.
Just to be clear, indeed 7b was closed, not 7a.
Merci beaucoup, Raph. Norway, s'il vous plaît, je vous en prie.
Thank you, Co-Chair. And thank you for the tip for presenting the progress report. We have a couple of questions, especially regarding the potential options for the future configuration and function of committees. We noted that there is an estimated needs for 20 experts groups for the air talk. We understood that the proposal from the TIP is that all air talk members will participate in only one of these sub.
Je pense qu'il y a un petit souci avec le micro. Est-ce que l'honorable délégué peut se servir du micro qui est juste à côté?
Here? Okay. I can try with this one.
Je vous en prie. Ouais.
So just the question was about how the air talk members would be expected to participate in the subgroups that have been presented for the air talk, if that would be an opportunity to participate in only one of these subgroups or both of them. And also, we note that the TIP states that there's an ongoing process of critically reviewing and renewing the organization and membership of the AirTalk to provide broader and more varied expertise to address cross-cutting and emerging issues. And we are wondering whether the TIP will provide more information to the parties on this review. Also turning to the issue of PFAS, we would like to thank particularly the TIP for pointing out how regulatory development on PFAS could affect and challenge different areas of work under the Montreal Protocol. This gives to policymakers that are working on this issue an indication of which specific uses might need particular consideration. Indeed, it is not an easy task when developing such potential policies to assess, in one hand, how to address concerns and avoid a significant environmental problem early enough, and in another hand, make sure that this is not undermining other environmental and societal achievements and purposes. And those are, just to name some of them, reduction of direct and indirect emissions of greenhouse gases, including phasing down of HFCs, improving energy efficiency, ensuring affordable and accessible essential medicine, as well as reliable fire suppression technologies. So that is why in the PFAS restriction proposal that is being assessed in Europe, derogations have been proposed to address those specific applications where information that was submitted indicated that alternatives are not yet available or would not fulfill all the requirements. And we appreciate that information on those derogations were highlighted in the progress report. Also, this list of challenges is telling us that there is, in many sectors, already other alternatives that are not defined as PFAS, meaning that there are many opportunities already, as of today, to transition directly to those alternatives. Actually, the aim of those regulatory developments is really about paving the way to transition to alternative to PFAS in the applications where those are available, and at the same time will provide similar levels of functionality required in the various applications. For example, in terms of energy efficiency, those alternatives could, in many cases, offer high performances at lower prices. We recognize the additional challenges that some ongoing PFAS regulatory developments are bringing into the work of this body. But we believe that those challenges can be addressed in an open and collaborative way between all stakeholders. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable délégué de Norway. Nous donnons la parole au Mexique.
Sí, muchas gracias, señor copresidente. Y siendo la primera vez que esta delegación toma la palabra en la reunión, queremos agradecer al Reino de Tailandia por recibirnos una vez más, así como a la Secretaría del Ozono por su gran labor en la organización y realización de nuestra reunión. Agradecemos también todo el trabajo del grupo de evaluación, el TIP, que como siempre nos aporta información valiosa y necesaria para el diseño de las acciones que nuestros países sabremos adoptar para cumplir con nuestros compromisos conforme al Protocolo de Montreal. En este sentido, queremos referirnos en particular al reporte del FTOC para complementar esta información. Elogiamos el trabajo realizado que refuerza nuestras consideraciones en la preparación de nuestro KIP particularmente, pero queremos enfatizar que en este proceso de preparación tenemos dudas con respecto al impacto de las importaciones de polioles premezclados en el proceso de transición a sustancias alternativas a los HFCs, en un contexto en el que la disponibilidad de alternativas es aún incierto. Sabemos que es un tema en el que ya está trabajando el TOC, pero queremos refrendar que es de importancia para esta delegación. Consideramos que polioles premezclados son un producto que pudiera contener sustancias que ya no se consumen en el país, y es un tema en el que quizá los países exportadores debieran poner atención en la manera en que son registradas las exportaciones de dichos productos. Muchas gracias.
Merci à l'honorable délégué du Mexique. Avant de poursuivre, je voudrais faire l'état des lieux de la liste. Les parties qui souhaitent intervenir sont les suivantes: le Sénégal, la Tunisie, le Lesotho, l'Argentine, la Chine, le Brésil et l'Union européenne. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres partis qui voudraient bien prendre la parole? Manifestez-vous pour que nous puissions gérer au mieux la liste d'intervention. Je donne la parole au Sénégal pour son intervention.
Président, bonjour mesdames et messieurs chers délégués, et nous saluons encore une fois les éminents experts du GTE pour leur travail. C'est un travail dur, difficile, vu le nombre d'experts, cela donne une idée. J'ai 3 questions. La première question concerne l'utilisation des hydrocarbures sur les grands systèmes. Vu les propriétés d'inflammabilité qui sont connues concernant les hydrocarbures, j'aimerais savoir quelles sont les limites pour installer des charges dans ces grands systèmes. Parce que plus on a plus de charges, plus quand il y a problème, plus ces risques-là augmentent. Déjà, sur les petits systèmes, le propane déjà doit être géré, mais vous imaginez si vous mettez de plus grandes quantités. C'est ça la préoccupation. Sur le deuxième élément, c'est sur les halons. Un des experts a parlé que sur l'aviation, un avion qui a une durée de vie de 30 ans utilise le halon continu. Mais s'il arrive qu'il y a un besoin de l'utiliser et que sous le protocole de Montréal, les halons doivent être éliminés, s'il n'en a pas, comment il va faire? C'est la deuxième question. L'autre question, c'est sur la mousse. Là aussi, il y a les HFO qui apparaissent comme alternative, comme agent gonflant. Mais lequel entre les deux? Il y a 1, 2, 3, 4 YF, il y a 1, 2, 3, 4 ZE. Mais simplement, j'ai vu HFO. Mais il serait bon de savoir, entre ces deux-là, qu'est-ce qui va au niveau de l'industrie de la mousse, du secteur de la mousse. Mais autre élément aussi, c'est l'utilisation des HFO génère ce qu'on appelle, il y a l'acide trifluoroacétique qui est toxique. Les HFO ont des avantages sur le climat puisqu'ils ont un potentiel de réchauffement global très faible de l'ordre de 4 et qui n'impactent pas sur l'ozone, c'est des avantages. Mais voilà les inconvénients. Comment gérer cela? Et je termine sur la climatisation automobile. Là aussi, les HFO se présentent comme alternative au R134A. Et là aussi, on connaît ces HFO présentent des avantages. Potentiel de réchauffement global très faible, zéro potentiel de destruction de l'ozone. Mais le problème qu'on a ici, c'est leur inflammabilité. Comment gérer cela? Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable délégué du Sénégal. Je vais rappeler la liste que nous avons. Les parties sont les suivantes: la Tunisie, le Lesotho, l'Argentine, la Chine, le Brésil, l'Union européenne, les États-Unis et le Cuba. Jusque-là, je n'ai pas vu d'autres parties souhaitant d'intervenir. Donc, je vais clôturer la liste ainsi. Après le Cuba, nous n'avons plus d'intervention. L'intervenant, la prochaine partie qui va intervenir, c'est la Tunisie. Après la Tunisie, nous allons donner la parole au GETE pour que le groupe puisse apporter les éléments de réponse. Et nous allons reprendre maintenant avec la seconde liste. La Tunisie, vous avez la parole.
شكرا السيد رئيس المشارك. كما يتوجه بالشكر إلى فريق التقييم التقني التابع لتياب، وأتقدم بسؤالين اثنين. السؤال الأول يتعلق بقطاع إنتاج الرغاوي الصلبة، وخاصة منها المؤسسات الصغيرة والمتوسطة التي تستعمل مواد HFC الهيدروفلوروكربونية في كعامل نفخ الرغاوي. ومن بين البدائل المقترحة سيكلوبنتين وكذلك HFO. هناك إشكال كبير بالنسبة للمؤسسات الصغيرة والمتوسطة على مستوى استعمال هذين البديلين، فإن استعمال سيكلوبنتين غير ممكن من الناحية الفنية نظرا لكونها الوحدات الصناعية صغيرة الحجم لا يمكنها من ناحية السلامة استخدام هذه المادة. في حين المادة الثانية كذلك HFO 1234 زي اي فإنها كذلك غير مستقرة، ومن الناحية الكيميائية فهي تتحلل وتنتج حامض ثلاثي الفليور الذي يضر بالبيئة بصفة عامة، وكذلك هذه المادة أصبحت مقننة في اتفاقية ريتش، وبالتالي يصعب علينا يعني اعتماد هذا البديل كبديل لمواد HFC أو مواد HCFC. وبالتالي نريد توضيح أكثر، خاصة وأننا على جميع البلدان في طور إعداد خطة العمل المستقبلية للتخفيض التدريجي من المواد الهيدروفلوروكربونية عن طريق مشاريع الكيب. ثم النقطة الثانية كذلك في قطاع الرذاذات الطبية، كما تفضل مندوب السنغال سابقا من ناحية البديل، حيث في أغلب الأحيان تستعمل مادة HFC 134,000 كغاز دافع، ومن بين المقترحات كذلك يعني غير واضحة، وبالتالي نريد أكثر توضيح في هذا المستوى. مع الشكر.
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable délégué de la Tunisie. À présent, je vais donner la parole au GETE pour les réponses et nous allons reprendre par la suite avec la suite de la liste.
Thank you, Co-Chair. I'll go ahead and start the TEEP response to the questions. I appreciate them. I will start with the comments and the questions that we heard from Norway. With regard to the future configuration, I think we are very mindful of our experts work as voluntary members to the TAC as well as to the TEEP. So we are very mindful that the work we ask them to do comprises not their only commitment. And so it will be a consideration to make sure that we manage the membership in those two big groups. So I think it would not be ideal for a member to serve on both groups, as it would be quite difficult to manage sort of a workload committing to produce reports and information to both groups. So we are mindful of making sure we're not overloading the experts that would serve on the RTOC within those two big groups. However, we also recognize that there are some cross-cutting issues even within those two groups in the RTOC, very similar issues. The same refrigerants, for example, and the references to associated industry standards for equipment and using those, the same refrigerants might be similar, some cross-cutting issues. So we recognize and we'll look to the co-chairs to sort of manage and make sure that there is sort of equity in the request made to experts serving on that committee in the two big groups that we proposed. I think there were some additional comments, and we appreciate the comments from Norway with regard to the issue on PFAS. You know, it is an issue that we will continue to follow because we understand the potential impacts in terms of sort of decisions going forward and the pace of the transition. So it's certainly an important issue for us to consider in our sector assessments. Thank you.
There was a question from the distinguished delegate of Senegal about the hydrocarbons used in large system for refrigeration. I would suggest that you can refer to the split chapter in our assessment report where we talk about large systems, and we gave instruction how the large systems can use hydrocarbons. Of course, there are limitations, but there is a way to comply with that.
In response to the question on Halon 1301, continued use in civil aviation, recognizing that aircraft being produced today have a 30 or more year lifetime, the only Halon 1301 that is available to continue to support new production or servicing of existing aircraft is from recycled, reclaimed. So it's been previously produced. So the biggest response to what can be done is, firstly, don't destroy any Halon 1301. Civil aviation and other enduring uses are going to need it. Secondly, anything that can cause a delay or uncertainty in going to alternatives to Halons within civil aviation needs to be considered very carefully before implementing. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup au type. Je vous en prie, allez.
Thank you, Co-Chair. There was a question from Tunisia about alternatives to pressurised metered dose inhalers and what the alternatives are if HFC 134A isn't available. In our assessment report, we outline a very detailed analysis of the alternatives, and certainly there are alternatives like dry powder inhalers and soft mist inhalers to metered dose inhalers, although they're not necessarily always, well, in the case of dry powder inhalers, young children can't use them, and sometimes elderly patients with difficulty breathing in can't take them. So there's, you know, not all alternatives are suitable for all patients. I would also say for Article 5 parties, affordability and accessibility of some of those alternatives I mentioned, dry powder inhalers and soft mist inhalers, is an issue because of cost and accessibility in some countries. We know that there are 4 companies that have made announcements on their developments to develop low GWP propellants, which are HFO 1234 ZEE and HFC 152A, and that those companies in their announcements have indicated that they might launch new products in 2025 onwards. There have been no announcements to date, however, about any redevelopment processes for salbutamol metered dose inhalers, which are the most major kind of product in the metered dose inhaler format. So there's no alternatives currently announced to date in terms of the development of those propellants in metered dose inhalers. So there are challenges there.
The FTalk comments related to the questions of distinct delegate from Tunisia. We would like to mention that we agree that use of hydrocarbons as a blowing agent in foams can bring difficulties for small enterprises. But we want to say that new formulations blown with HFOs are stable nowadays, and new products have been launched that can be used with no major problems. Just would like also to point out that in case that energy efficiency is not critical, water-blown foams can also be used. And for more details, we can talk offline for discussions. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup au type. Nous allons poursuivre avec la liste des partis qui souhaitent intervenir. Le Lesotho, je vous en prie. Soyez bref et concis. Je vous en prie, soyez bref et concis. Allez-y.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Let me first of all thank TIP and F-Talk for the good presentation and their good analysis. I just have one question that even today we still do not have alternatives to some of the substances. Can we say, do we have a significant progress in terms of phasing out? Because if even today we still talk of halons, and we still have those gases which do not have alternatives, can we say we have the significant progress? How can you quantify it? The other issue is that most of the solutions that come, they can't balance the issue of safety, economic and environmental impact, because you'll find that if we balance the issue of environment, but the issue of safety also we still have on the other side. Is there any solutions which we can find that can at least to some extent balance those three? Thank you very much.
Merci à l'honorable délégué du Lesotho. L'Argentine, je vous en prie.
Muchas gracias, señor copresidente. En primer lugar, nos gustaría nuevamente agradecer al TIP y al GETE por la presentación y el trabajo realizado. Nos llama la atención y nos pone en una situación nuevamente un poco de confusión los datos presentados por el F-Talk acerca de que los costos de los HFC se están acercando o casi igualando a los de los HFO. Me gustaría en ese sentido traer a colación las palabras de la hermana República de Colombia expresados ayer con respecto a la incoherencia respecto de lo que estamos viviendo en nuestros propios países. Realmente no entendemos si esta es la situación, si realmente, como también se dijo en este reporte, se están solucionando los problemas de proveeduría de los HFO, porque es que todos los países de nuestra región estamos teniendo problemas, tal como ya fueron expresados en las diferentes intervenciones que hicieron Chile, Colombia, México, nuestro país. Es realmente preocupante ver que seguimos en esta situación donde ya en varias reuniones venimos sosteniendo el problema de las alternativas y, sin embargo, seguimos sin encontrar una solución ya al borde de las fechas de cumplimiento de todos los proyectos o incluso en situaciones donde los países han tenido que pedir el uso temporario de HFC o bien devolver los fondos por no poder implementar los proyectos. Es realmente algo muy problemático y en ese sentido nos gustaría hacer eco de las palabras y las preocupaciones expresadas por la delegación de Noruega acerca de cómo todo esto afecta al cumplimiento de los proyectos que fueron acordados. Solo para dar un ejemplo, tenemos notas de los proveedores diciendo los precios a los cuales se comercializa hoy el producto en Argentina, con 120 días de demoras en las entregas, con precios que están en el orden de del 250% de los montos en los que fueron aprobados nuestros proyectos y los montos en los que se consideraron en el momento en que se negociaron, por ejemplo, la enmienda de Kigali o cualquiera de los proyectos que están aprobados para nuestra región. En ese sentido, también ahora sumamos la preocupación, como decía, expresada por la delegación de Noruega respecto del problema que podría traer la situación con los PFA. El GETE ha realizado este minucioso análisis del impacto que tendrán en la disponibilidad de alternativas de bajo PSG y las provisiones que se han establecido en la Unión Europea y en otros países. En ese sentido, resulta muy preocupante entender cuál va a ser el norte, porque si estábamos supuestamente entrando en un estado donde se va a regularizar la proveeduría, pero estamos ya a su vez en una situación donde estamos analizando situaciones de prohibición por los problemas que podrían traer a la salud humana, claramente nos encontramos en esta otra nueva situación donde ya hemos escuchado que hay sectores privados que están evaluando sus inversiones en el HFO por esta situación. Por ello, dado que la producción de estas sustancias en la mayoría de los casos se da en países del artículo 2, nos gustaría solicitar que se evalúe concretamente cuál va a ser el impacto que va a tener esta prohibición de los usos de PFA sobre el cumplimiento de las medidas de eliminación de los HCFCs y HFCs por parte de los países del artículo 5, para entender efectivamente cuáles van a ser el impacto y los resultados y cómo esto va a comprometer al cumplimiento de los acuerdos que ya nuestros países han celebrado. Desde ya, muchas gracias.
Merci à l'honorable délégué de l'Argentine. La Chine, je vous en prie, vous avez la parole.
谢谢共同主席。我们代表也要感谢 TIP 专家所做的介绍。我们注意到 TIP 在总结缔约方 CTC 管控政策相似性时指出，缔约方普遍实施了 CTC 生产、进口、出口、使用、销售等多环节管理，原料注记、实验室分析用途、进出口配额息口等管理或备案，进出口企业及经销商登记备案、数据记录报告以及四硫化碳排放管控等政策措施。我们想进一步了解 TIP 在总结概括缔约方四硫化碳政策框架和管理程序相似性的同时，对这些政策框架和管理程序的效用，也就是有效性，有没有一些初步的评价和考虑？这个问题是我们针对四硫化碳方面的，还有后面两个方面的问题，一个是甲基溴，一个是这个 PFAS。接下来是甲基溴，关于甲基溴替代品的问题。这里边是有两个，一个是甲基溴 QPS 用途的替代品是否存在这个专利的问题，技术专利。与甲基溴相比较，相关的替代品的成本水平是怎么样的？替代成本。甲基溴的第二个问题，在今后的进展报告中 ，TIP 是否可以进一步提供甲基溴 QPS 用途替代品的技术和经济可行性分析，并编写相关替代品的案例分析。第三个方面是这个。第三个方面的问题是涉及 TIP 的，是不是 PFAS 的？我们注意到 TIP 报告指出，哈龙、制冷等多个行业的一些替代品属于 PFAS。 按照相关法律法规进展，这类物质的使用今后可能会被限制或者淘汰。我们代表团非常关注这个问题对相关行业替代技术选择乃至履约进程的影响。希望 TIP 继续密切跟踪 PFAS 有关的政策法规的进展情况，进一步结合基加利修正案的履约要求，对哈龙汽车空调、水冷水机组等相关行业分析 PFAS 管控政策对这些行业的替代品的发展和选择的潜在影响。谢谢。
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable délégué de la Chine. Brésil, vous avez la parole, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Co-Chair. I would like also to thank TEEP experts for the excellent reports and presentations, since it is always good that we have science guiding our discussions. Brazil would have a few questions about methyl-bromide. First one, if we would be interested in knowing if there is a more comprehensive assessment of alternatives to methyl-bromide, specifically in relation to their global warming potential. It seems that some alternatives to methyl-bromide may have high GWP, and information that should be considered when we evaluate the possibility of using them. And I do completely agree on that with the delegate from Lesotho regarding a balanced approach when we discuss alternatives. We would also support China on their suggestion that in future work, the TEEP also engages in economic analysis on the feasibility of alternatives to methyl-bromide. We were also curious about MB uses that do not satisfy pre-shipment, even though we believe they might exist. A large share of uses is based on exporting country requirements. So even from a market point of view, it would be cheaper to export product without adding methyl-bromide, meaning that if it is used, there would be a reason for doing so. Maybe we don't have the information here, but we believe that there would be a reason for it. So we would like some clarification about that part. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable délégué du Brésil. L'Union européenne, vous avez la parole, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We would like to be added to the list of parties wanting to thank the TEEP for the excellent work in all the technical committees and to prepare the 23 progress report. We would have a question to the MB talk related to stocks of methyl bromide held globally. The general references to stocks of methyl bromide of globally held stocks are said to be around 1,000 tons. And we would like to ask two questions. If MB could explain how these amounts of stocks have been estimated, and also what remaining uncertainties remain as regards the overall level of stocks of methyl bromide. Thank you. Mr. Co-Chair.
Merci à l'Union européenne. Je donne la parole aux États-Unis d'Amérique.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair, and many thanks to TEEP and the members of the talks. We know that they work very hard, and as we heard during the Quad assessment report, this is in addition to whatever their regular jobs are as well. We did have a couple questions and perhaps a couple clarifications based on some of the questions and answers we've already heard. We had understood, and we want to just confirm our understanding from the FTAC, that additional capacity is now available for HFO and HCFO production, And if they could confirm whether or not this has eased the supply chain issues, particularly supply chain issues that were occurring in different regions. That would be something we would just like a brief clarification on. For the FS talk, we understood and we heard very clearly, I think the co-chair said, do not destroy 1301. We wanted to maybe follow up and understand how that is impacting the run-out date and whether or not they think if there were additional destruction of 1301, would that bring that run-out date even sooner or more likely to be at the sooner end of the range they provided to the parties. We'd also like to ask the FS talk about what we understood from them to be concerns about regulations, other regulations outside this body that were impacting the availability of alternatives. And we had understood the reference to, I think one of the earlier commenters parties may have noted that there are exceptions or derogations from those regulations. And I think our question for the FS talk is whether they think that kind of exception is sufficient to ensure alternatives are brought to market, and whether or not they think a lack of certainty, perhaps because those may only be time limited, is that going to also impact the availability of alternatives? For the MC talk, we heard in response to the question from Tunisia that there is some work going on with I don't know if it was announcements. I think you said announcements on alternatives, and I think in that instance 152A and HFO 1234ZE was referenced. I think in the presentation we only saw ZE, so maybe just to clarify. And then if you could explain, these are announcements, but are these consistent with perhaps some parties may have registered alternatives, or are these announcements ahead of something like that about the work they may be doing on the alternatives, as opposed to whether or not those alternatives are available in certain markets? And I'm almost done. For the RTOC, we had a question in particular, and perhaps in response to some of the comments we heard. I think it was Senegal and perhaps Lesotho noted the lack of the need for additional alternatives. We wondered if they could speak to whether or not life cycle refrigerant management is another way. We know that the FS talk spoke quite a bit on the, not just at this meeting, but over the years, on the value of recycling halon to avoid the need for production. And we're just wondering whether or not the RTOC could speak to whether refrigerant management or life cycle refrigerant management is sufficient, could be sufficient to help ease transition burden, and whether or not they can meet the same purity as newly produced HFCs, so there would be no purity issues. And then lastly, in regards to the TEEP's overall presentation, and in particular the aspects of that dealt with some changes they are proposing to the TEEP, we had a few questions. One question we have is to better understand what a working group is. So we understand that the TEEP terms of reference allow for the TEEP to set up temporary subsidiary bodies. Those bodies can exist for a year and then could be renewed. Typically the TEEP refers to these as task forces. So we just want to see if we could get a better understanding of what is the difference between a task force and a working group, and perhaps there isn't one, but in light of the language in the TEEP's tour, we just wanted some clarity around that. And then with regard to the concept, and maybe also reacting to other parties' questions on the RTOC, maybe there's a few questions we have here, and this is something that we'd want to discuss further. As we understood the numbers, there are 43 members and 3 co-chairs currently of the RTOC. We understood that the idea here is to perhaps have subcommittees. Our own recollection, going back maybe a number of years from when another talk used subcommittees, was this was not necessarily always an easy place to be, particularly when it comes to reaching consensus amongst the 2 groups. And so we wondered if the TEEP has reflected on that and whether or not it would be better to have 2 separate bodies two separate talks as opposed to one talk. And then perhaps in response to some of the questions and responses, we understood a point about these being the same refrigerants, but of course these are the same chemicals. The alternatives being used across our many sectors are often the same chemistry. So we're not sure that that necessarily suggested to us the need for one body, especially if they're working independently. And then our understanding of IEC and in the US UL standards is that the standards for refrigeration equipment and air conditioning equipment are usually distinct. It's not one standard applied to both. Now we do understand for the refrigerant naming convention like ASHRAE, they're all named together, but the actual approval by equipment type is usually distinct. So we're not sure we understood why standards in and of themselves would be a rationale. So we'd just like to better understand from the TEEP what their thinking is, because as I noted, we don't recall necessarily an easy situation when we had a talk that had two subcommittees. And so we do think that there may be a situation here where if these groups could be two distinct groups, that might be something we want to discuss. So we just wanted to flag that and see if the TEEP could give us some further clarity. Thank you.
Merci à l'honorable délégué des États-Unis. Je donne la parole au Cuba et nous clôturons ainsi la liste. Après le Cuba, nous aurons les réponses venant des experts.
Sí, buenos días a todos los aquí presentes. Quería hacer una pregunta que para nosotros es muy importante. Entre las alternativas a los aerosoles mostrados en el informe, los aerosoles farmacéuticos, se encuentra el 152A y el HFO1234ZE. Unas empresas en algunos de nuestros países que use esta alternativa, es decir, que use 134A como agente propelente y deseara cambiar a una reconversión a 152A, que tiene un GWP de 124, o el HFO1234ZE, ¿sería muy complicada la reconversión o es posible realizar una reconversión sencilla, muy similar al cambio de refrigerantes, como hacíamos en los sistemas RAC? La pregunta es porque en el informe se ve los estudios en aerosoles nuevos y queríamos ver si era posible hacer este cambio en una empresa que ya produciera con 134A. Otra pregunta que nos han realizado en nuestro país es si existe alguno de los estudios con refrigerantes naturales en el uso de propelente para los inhaladores de dosis medida o aerosoles farmacéuticos. Muchísimas gracias.
Merci à l'honorable délégué du Cuba. À présent, nous allons remettre la parole au GET pour les éléments de réponse.
If I could respond first on behalf of MCTOC to the question from China about our report in response to the decision on ongoing emissions of CTC, where the question was, did we consider the effectiveness of policy frameworks in the work that we did? I guess the first thing I would say is that the decision actually didn't ask us to do that. It just asked us to review the information and to present it. So we undertook no assessment of the effectiveness of the policy frameworks. But having said that, that's not something we would normally do. It would be difficult for us to undertake that type of assessment because our mandate is to do technical and economic assessment and to not assess policy. My next response is in response to the intervention from the United States, asking for further clarification on the comments that I made about alternatives to metered dose inhalers. Given that on one of the slides in this presentation today, there was only mention of HFO1234ZEE. That was on the slide relating to PFAS. So obviously we were trying to refer there to potential alternative propellants that might be impacted by some of the emerging PFAS policy. HFC152A is not impacted by that policy because it does not degrade to trifluoroacetic acid as a breakdown product, and trifluoroacetic acid is one of those substances which is in that broad OECD definition that some countries are taking up in their emerging policies. In regard to the announcements about product launches, I was referring to product launches. Those announcements, companies have said we will be doing developments for alternative propellants. Some have indicated that they will be adopting HFO1234ZE, or one has, and others have indicated they would be developing alternative propellants with 152A, and other companies haven't actually specified yet what propellant they might be going with, because they're perhaps in earlier stages of development. So all we have at the moment is these announcements that product launches are planned, and that their announcements have said that the earliest date that those product launches might be is 2025. So there are no alternatives using those propellants currently available. They have not been approved by health regulatory agencies, and they would have to go through those processes before they would enter the market. And as you would know, they're lengthy processes. In response to the question from Cuba, the question was in relation to the alternatives, propellants for metered dose inhalers, noting that one company in Cuba currently uses HFC134A and would like to transition to, I think it was HFC152A. There was a bit of confusion with the translation, so I apologise. And asking, is the conversion complicated? We did mention in our presentation that there could be incremental costs in moving from the high GWP propellants to the lower propellants that parties might need to consider, and that's because the new propellants will incur costs, including reformulation, because the formulations will need to be optimised for the new propellants, the drug formulations, and the contents of the metered dose inhalers will need to be reformulated. Stability studies would need to be undertaken, clinical trials. There would be a need to look at the packaging components that might need to be changed. There'll be regulatory submissions. There'll be storage of bulk propellant that might need to be considered because the 152A might have some flammability issues in the manufacturing that might need to be considered. And that we considered that planning to use HFC 152A, for example, you might need to invest an estimated further 10 to 15% or more of their original capital expenditure to modify production lines to cope with those risks. There was also a question about, and for further information on some of these things as well, on alternatives, please refer to the assessment report. There was also a question about any studies on hydrocarbons, I think was hydrocarbon propellants. We've looked at this in the past, and again, there's some information in the assessment report around hydrocarbon propellants. There was one development process that was undertaken 10 years ago, I'd like to say, which didn't ever come to market. As a committee, we have said in the past that there's cardiac sensitivity issues associated with hydrocarbon propellants that, in our view, might make hydrocarbons unsuitable as propellants.
There were quite a few questions on methyl bromide, and we'll do our best to answer those now. The first issue was the delegate from China raised an issue of patent issues with alternatives. It came over as the translation, but we think it's registration issues with alternatives. And that's common for all countries, and the registration processes are reasonably quick in some countries and a bit slower in others, but normally it would take a few years before an alternative was registered. But some of them are registered now globally in various regions, and will expand to others as they become suitable and available. The second question from China was about preparing case studies in future reports on QPS, and this may be arising because of the confusion that comes from whether they're in different categories and how we put them in the right categories. And we would welcome being able to put case studies in future reports, and in fact we do that and have done that in past reports. We're also asked about the economic analyses of alternatives, and we are one of the rare committees that does have an economist on our committee, and all our assessments are done for the technical and economic feasibility taken in mind of all the alternatives. And fortunately in the QPS space, a lot of the chemical alternatives are of similar cost, which is good. Then from the delegate of Brazil, we were asked first about the GWP and were we keeping an eye on the GWP of alternatives that would be used to methyl bromide, and the one that was of concern was sulfur fluoride. The good news is that fortunately most of the alternatives to methyl bromide are not halons, and sulfur fluoride is unique, and therefore most of the alternatives don't have GWP consequences of concern. The other thing is that for SF, we're looking at recapture to minimise the consequences of SF. The second part of the Brazilian question was about uses which don't satisfy pre-shipment that we put up because of confusion, perhaps, of categories. We also agree that the importance of maintaining pest hygiene within countries is incredibly important. What we hope is that parties use the definitions to make sure that they're falling into those categories properly, and that if they aren't, that we use alternatives that can also keep the pest status at the same level as one gets with methyl bromide. Finally, the European Union asked about stocks held globally and how we estimated the amounts that we put in our reports. That amount is becoming less and less certain as time moves on, because we used to be able to estimate how much was left from this critical use nomination process, because parties declared stocks, and when we travelled to countries, they used to tell us how much stock they had available in some countries, and we were able to apportion their use for the critical uses to know how much of that stock was left. As time goes on, there's no reporting of stocks from anyone unless they want to do so, and so we get less clarity on what stocks are held globally. With that, I think we have answered all the questions. If not, please see us in the corridors. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup au groupe. Yeah.
There were a series of questions to the FS talk that really all center on civil aviation. So let me address this as sort of a civil aviation-wide response. Compliance under the Montreal Protocol for production and consumption within the halon sector has essentially occurred since 1994. So there is no production or consumption of halons for fire suppression currently, and all uses, including civil aviation, have relied on and will continue to rely on recycled, reclaimed halons. Now, having said that, we've, in the FS talk, have always said the strategy was to find alternatives, starting with the easiest, progressing to the hardest. And we are now to the hardest. For every other subsector in fire suppression, there are alternatives, some of which are high GWP HFCs, some of which might be considered PFAS under certain definitions, that have alternatives to halon, except civil aviation. It is the last one left, and it's the hardest. Balancing environmental considerations, economic considerations with safety has made it the hardest. I'm sure you can each imagine in your heads how scary it would be to have a fire on an aircraft that you're flying on. How much scarier it would be flying over the ocean with no safe landing site for hours away. The industry has managed this with the use of halons, which are unique in their fire suppression and safety capabilities, and human health safety capabilities. So industry is taking this very, very seriously. In particular, since 2015, when we told them they're gonna run out of halon likely before the end of the economic lives of the aircraft they're producing. So they've been working very hard at this. Last year in September, at what they call their General Assembly, which is equivalent to a meeting of the parties of the Montreal Protocol, industry presented a paper that said regulations that are adding uncertainty, such as PFAS regulations proposed or existing, adding uncertainty to their availability as use of halon alternatives in the 30, 40, 50-year lifetime of aircraft that are designed today is causing them pause. This is not theoretical. I'm not saying it might influence them. They've said their efforts are on pause while they consider what the world is going to do on these issues. So we have to very carefully consider the issue over, we have a small finite amount of halon left in the world. Civil aviation needs a significant amount of that. And if they can't have certainty going to an alternative in their lifetime, 30, 40, 50 years, they're not going to do anything. So we have to really consider this carefully. Thank you.
There were some questions around foam supply from US and Argentina. So maybe just to clarify a little bit that their additional capacity has started up for several different HFO alternatives, as well as some additional cyclopentane. So that those supply concerns have eased some as these new plants have come online. So not only for cyclopentane, but 1233ZD, 1336MZZE and Z isomers all have new capacity online. We have tried to stay in very close contact with companies that have raised this concern about available supply. And they seem to be moving forward now with their transitions. In addition to that, there were some questions around, how companies maybe are proceeding. There's been a lot of focus on new formulations that would reduce the loading of some of the fluorocarbons in them, trying to optimize cost as well as energy efficiency, thermal loading, as well as other properties has been kind of an area of focus. And we see, a constant stream of papers around work to optimize these various features. I hope that covers off. Thank you.
I'm sorry to have to come back here from the FS talk. There was one question I forgot to answer. That was from the U.S. on what the impact will be of destruction of Halon 1301. It clearly, the availability of Halon for destruction would be coming solely from the accessible or available supplies, which would then reduce that for the enduring uses. So that will serve to move the run-out date closer to the soonest end. So I think that would clarify the question from the U.S.
Nous remercions les experts.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. So first, a quick answer to the distinguished member from Lesotho. The answer is based on our presentation on the assessment report. There is no one clear choice. It's for each application we have to balance several parameters, and for each application there is a choice. So please refer to the application chapters within the RTOC report. You will find that for different applications, different environments, there are different choices. For the distinguished member from the US, I'll start by your answer on the LCM, or the recycling, reclamation, and reuse. I don't think there is enough or parity. There is a significant increase in capacity, as we have seen yesterday in the Energy Efficiency Working Group. There will be about a threefold increase in capacity by the year 2050, which would mean 3 times as much refrigerant consumption. So even if we can conserve all the refrigerant that is available, we will be able to just have parity for 1/3 of what is needed. Now, with regard to your question about the difference between the task force and the energy efficiency, the US is correct. Our tour for the TSB has been that task forces consists from outside experts. In the case of the Energy Efficiency Working Group, we considered this as a working group of RTOC with TEEP and FTOC co-chairs to respond to the decision in the TEEP progress report. With regard to the RTOC, the first thing is we have, with the new membership, we have significantly improved the geographic and gender balance to ensure the process and consensus. With regard to the IEC, yes, we understand that it is specific to products, and the standard, the IEC standards and safety for a refrigerator is completely different than the standard for an air conditioner. But when we look at application like ISO 5151 or ASHRAE 15, they are what we call application standards, and they are cross-cutting. So there are too many cross-cutting standards, and we need to be able to consider them. So from a system perspective, we need to look at these, and we have restructured from within. So why not 2 talks? We have proposed that last year, the proposal did not receive support from the parties, and that's why this time we have restructured from within. Thank you.
Merci à nos experts. Le GETE nous a fait une brillante présentation. Nous avions eu beaucoup d'informations, une large gamme d'informations. À présent, nous allons clôturer la session de questions-réponses. Une fois encore, nous remercions le GET pour sa disponibilité et toujours pour son dévouement et le travail toujours abattu avec succès et excellence. Nous vous prions à présent de rejoindre vos places, mais restez à l'écoute. On pourrait toujours revenir vers vous au cas où on souhaiterait avoir des éclaircissements sur d'autres points. Nous passons maintenant à l'examen un par un des sous-paragraphes du point 8. Nous avions déjà au début énuméré les questions qui seront considérées au niveau des sous-paragraphes. Passons maintenant au point 8A de l'ordre du jour portant sur la demande de dérogation pour utilisation critique du bromure de méthyle pour 2024. Comme nous l'a indiqué le GETE, en 2023, une partie ne relevant pas de l'article 5, le Canada, a présenté une demande d'exemption pour utilisation critique en 2024. L'évaluation du MBTOC est incluse dans le volume 2 du rapport 2023 du GETE et un résumé relatif à cette nomination est inclus dans l'addendum 1 de la note du secrétariat, le document 45/2/addendum 1. Le MBTOC préparera un rapport final sur son l'évolution de cette candidature et les recommandations finales à examiner par la MOB 35. Le rapport final devait être publié avant la MOB. En effet, la tradition voudrait que ce point de l'ordre du jour du groupe de travail à composition non limitée soit utilisé pour poser des questions au MBTOC et recevoir des réponses, en gardant à l'esprit que le rapport final sera présenté à la MOP et que les discussions auront lieu lors de la MOP sur la base de ce rapport final. Cet état de fait étant établi, le point étant fait, je vais ouvrir une session de discussion pour qu'on puisse échanger sur la question. La session est ouverte. Qui voudrait prendre la parole? La parole circule. Il y a des partis qui se sont déjà manifestés. L'Union européenne et le Canada. L'Union européenne d'abord. Je vous en prie. Après le Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Could we please come in after Canada? Sorry for that.
L'Union européenne voudrait intervenir après le Canada? C'est ce que je comprends.
Yes, Mr. Co-Chair.
D'accord. Le Canada, s'il vous plaît, je vous en prie.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and we would like to go after the European Union. No, it's thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and good day to all. As we're the party that has submitted a nomination, we would like to thank the MB Talk for their work on assessing Canada's 2024 critical use nomination for strawberry runners on Prince Edward Island. Canada would also like to congratulate Argentina, South Africa, and Australia, who in recent years have been able to end their methyl bromide nominations. And I assure you that we're working diligently to do the same. We realize that we find ourselves in the unenviable position to be the only party submitting critical use nomination this year. Canada's path to completely phase out methyl bromide for controlled uses has been challenging for this grower of strawberry runners on Prince Edward Island, where the alternative fumigants are unavailable. You will recall that substantial efforts and financial resources have been spent by the grower on this research program over many, many growing seasons in order to find a suitable alternative to methyl bromide. This included trials of several soilless technologies over a number of growing seasons, which faced, among other challenges, low yields for many varieties of strawberry runners, delays in maturity of the crops, and destruction of the soilless systems by birds in the field. In recent years, the focus of the research program turned to indoor soilless technology, which has shown some promises from a technical perspective, but remains economically difficult. This delegation recognizes that this technology is a suitable technical alternative and will be the best option going forward, given the unavailability of chemical fumigants on Prince Edward Island. Last year, at MOP34, Canada made the commitment to reduce its 2024 nomination and in subsequent years, and we intend to deliver on this commitment. So as you can see on the board above, for 2024, Canada has nominated a quantity of 3.857 tons of methyl bromide for a single grower for use as a pre-plant soil fumigant for strawberry runners on Prince Edward Island. This quantity is significantly lower than the amount of 4.65 tons approved by the parties last year. It's actually less than what is needed by the grower given the current stage of the research program. However, we recognize that it is a technically suitable alternative which has been identified. It will just need a brief transition period to fully scale up. Mr. Co-Chair, Canada indicated as part of our current nomination that this would be the second to last nomination for this use. We indicated in our current nomination that we intend to nominate no more than 2.85 tons of methyl bromide for the year 2025 and to not submit a nomination for 2026. We have carefully reviewed the assessment of the MB Talk, and we feel that it reflects our situation well. Canada is pleased to see that the MB Talk's interim recommendation aligns with our nomination, which we accept and agree with. Should any parties be interested in obtaining more details on our nomination, we would be happy to discuss in the margins at this meeting, and we're looking forward to the MB Talk's final recommendation ahead of the MOP in Nairobi later this year. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Merci à l'honorable délégué du Canada. Il s'est agi surtout d'une déclaration. À présent, je donne la parole à l'Union européenne.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. It's a very brief intervention on behalf of the EU and its member states. We would like to note these positive signs in Canada's nomination with a significant decrease in the amount compared to the last amount that was approved. And we would also like to commend Canada for signaling this shift towards now a policy-based approach for the phase-out and the intent to nominate 2.85 tons of methyl bromide for 25, and indeed not to submit a nomination for 26. And this indeed mirrors this very clear commitment that was made last year by the government of Canada in last year's decision. We believe that the decision for the critical use nomination that should be taken later this year should reflect such positive signs and the progress made, and also the intent for the phase out with no expected nomination for 26. We also note from the report that South Africa so last year was South Africa's last nomination, and that it is indeed confirmed that there is no more nomination from this party. And with that, thank you for the word, Mr. Co-Chair.
Merci à l'honorable délégué de l'Union européenne. Je ne vois pas d'autres partis qui souhaitent prendre la parole. Oui. Donc à présent, nous allons clôturer ce point à l'ordre du jour. Les discussions peuvent être poursuivies en marge de la réunion et nous aurons plus après cette discussion beaucoup plus dans un cadre formel, toujours à la prochaine réunion des partis. Donc ce point de l'ordre du jour est clôturé. Je passe la parole à mon co-chair pour le point suivant, le 8B.
Thank you, Wiedemer. And just to mention also to Canada, Prince Edward Island is still on my bucket list to visit. So you never know. We go to Agenda 8B, ongoing emissions of CTC. There was a decision at the last meeting of the parties on production, to get more information on production and uses of carbon tetrachloride. There have been requests for submissions from parties on a voluntary basis, and as Teep just mentioned, 5 have done so, and this information also has been used by Teep. The review of, let's say, those submissions is in section 5.4 of the panel's progress report, and you heard something about it already. And I would like to open the floor for interventions and discussions on this item. And I see Switzerland on my list. Switzerland, please.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and good morning or good day to all. We would first of all acknowledge the report provided by TEEP, the information provided on decision 34/6 concerning the ongoing emissions of CTC, but also their information provided on decision 34/5, which touches upon many relevant aspects which are also important to CTC. Would like to further express our gratitude to the Secretariat, who, as we just heard, sent the letter requesting information to the countries named in the decision. And we highly acknowledge the response from the 5 parties that provided valuable information to nourish the report by TEEP. We believe, nevertheless, that there would be still a big value if even further parties were able to provide the information maybe at a later point in time, voluntarily, of course. Also such parties that have no CTC production, but that have, by production, feedstock use or process agent use of CTC, which was also addressed in decision 35/6. Now, from the response provided in the TEEP report, we recognize with concern that the range of estimated emission rates indicate significant emissions from processes involving CTC. This could, in fact, be the answer to the discrepancy between earlier bottom-up and top-down estimates of CTC emissions. In other words, we are one step closer to solve the mystery of CTC, as it was termed in the context of a workshop that took place in Switzerland back in 2015. We think now that a next step is due. We believe that parties need to explore the options to strengthen the practices and technologies available to minimize those unintended CTC emissions and bring these emissions back closer to what they should have been from the beginning, insignificant. After listening carefully to the interventions of the parties in this room and having some first discussions in the margins of the meeting, we are currently finalizing a draft decision and intend to submit a CRP today. We are aware that the agenda of this meeting is still heavily loaded and that there will be only limited time to discuss it at this meeting. However, we would highly appreciate to get the opportunity to briefly introduce the CRP once it is available on the portal and parties had the opportunity to look at it. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you. Are there any other parties requesting the floor? It's Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. So back to the CTC discrepancy, an issue that this body has been considering for some time. One element perhaps which is worth emphasizing again during the presentation from the quadrennial report of the scientific assessment panel, we noted that due to a revised lifetime of CTC, the emissions are actually estimated to be higher than the last time we considered this issue. So I think in the previous assessment, there were around, the average was around 35 gigagrams per year, and now average emissions are about 44 gigagrams per year, which also means that the discrepancy in emissions is also higher. So this continues to be an issue of concern. We're aware that there is a substantial part of this amount which has been tentatively explained. So, you know, the TEEP has reported several times that somewhere around 25 gigagrams per year or more could be coming from uncontrolled sources, and we've discussed those at length at previous meeting. Now, with respect to where we are now, Canada appreciates the information submitted by some parties on their legislative and management framework related to the production, by-production, use and emissions of CTC, as well as a summary of this information presented in the 2023 TEEP Progress Report. We hope that this information can assist parties in making progress either in identifying specifically sources of CTC emissions or indeed in taking actions in reducing these emissions. One option that party could consider at this stage is, rather than spending a lot of time, focuses on identifying potential sources and volumes of CTC. I mean, we do think this work should go on. But at the same time, parties could maybe think about sharing best practices on how to manage and ultimately reduce emissions of CTC. We note that actually the report by the TEEP, which summarizes submission by parties, suggests that at least some countries already have measures in place and management systems to monitor and minimize emissions. Also, the quadrennial assessment report of the MCTOC includes already some information and techniques used to minimize and monitor emissions from production, by-production, feedstock, intermediates, products. These practices and techniques are meant to generally apply to controlled substances, but they are probably largely applicable to CTC more specifically. So just to say that we do have some useful information that could help us to continue to consider this issue at this meeting or ahead of the meeting of the parties, and we'll be interested in any proposal made by the delegation by Switzerland on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I give the next party the floor, I would like to know if other parties would like to take the floor. The next one is China, and now I see them popping up. It's Norway as well and Australia. Please push your button if you would like to take the floor, because then it's clear how we can conduct the meeting, and also we have some time left before lunch, so then I would like to propose to close the list. China, Norway, Australia and the EU. China, please, you have the floor.
谢谢联合主席。作为议定书的缔约方，中国政府非常关注可能产生石硫化碳排放的来源，认同加强石硫化碳管理的重要性，并对石硫化碳实施了严格的全过程管理。此前，我们向臭氧秘书处提交了中国石硫化碳管理程序及框架报告。这个报告内容涵盖了生产建设项目管理、副产石硫化碳的在线监控、备案管理、数据报告以及核查制度建立和实施情况。在以往的讨论中，我们都认识到石硫化碳在甲烷氯化物生产、原料用途使用等过程中始终存在无意排放，属于化工生产中的常见现象。同时，石硫化碳在储存、灌装、运输、产业处置等各个环节中的发散也难以避免。所以，这个石硫化碳这个排放问题是非常复杂。我们希望科学界持续开展相关研究，不但弥合石硫化碳自上而下和自下而上的排放差异。谢谢。
Thank you, China, and also by providing the information to the Secretariat which you refer to. Then I would like to go to give the floor to Norway.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We appreciate greatly the additional information on CTC emissions from the scientific panels, and also thank the parties that have provided information to the Secretariat. We agree with the distinguished delegates from Switzerland and Canada that the issue of CTC is still an issue of concern. The SAP quadrennial assessment report makes us aware that the atmospheric abundance of CTC continue to decrease at a lower rate than expected. This suggests that there's still need for more information to close the gap between the expected concentrations and the observed concentrations in the atmosphere. We suggest that this issue may be seen in relation to possible discussions on the area of feedstocks in general under Agenda Item 3, and we support gaining more information on this issue and support further discussions on the matter. So we're also looking forward to seeing the draft CRP proposal from Switzerland. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Norway. Then I would like to give the floor to Australia, please.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. And first of all, this delegation would like to thank the TEEP for the information they've provided on this, as well as the parties who have provided information to the TIP to better inform this body. The issue of higher than expected CTC concentrations in the atmosphere that do not match reported production, consumption and estimated emissions is one that's plagued the Montreal Protocol parties for many years. During that time, we've gone down many paths to try and reconcile reported CTC production and consumption with concentrations of CTC in the atmosphere, with some progress, but not enough to fully satisfy members. We note during the course of discussions, as well as the presentations that we've heard over the last 3.5 days, that this issue cuts across many of the areas that we've been talked about. Even the information provided under Agenda Item 7 on chemical pathways is an area that may assist parties to better understand why CTC emissions are rising despite best efforts and do not match reported production and consumption of CTC. The use of CTC as a feedstock, the production of CTC for use as a feedstock, and the inadvertent production of CTC from other chemical processes all provide opportunity for inadvertent emissions of CTC, which are not accounted for in Article 7 reporting. Australia would be interested to participate in any discussions at the OEWG or subsequent on how CTC emissions might be curbed. And we look forward to hearing from Switzerland on the Swiss thoughts on how to progress this matter. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Australia. Then I would like to give the floor to the EU as the last speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I can be very brief because in our earlier intervention we already expressed interest in further discussing the issue of feedstock in broader terms, also considering, as the delegate from Australia also mentioned, also considering the report presented under agenda point 7b. So we thank Switzerland for giving follow-up to this agenda point 8b, and will participate in any follow-up given to this CRP. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to get back to Switzerland. As I understand, you are preparing a CRP and are consulting, preparing a CRP and consulting with other parties. And definitely, it's a good idea that when we come back to this agenda item, that you can introduce that CRP later on. So that's what I would like to say as the end of this agenda item. And then I would like to go to what's happening during the lunchtime. So there will be a contact group on the proposed adjustment. So that meeting will take place during lunchtime, so be aware of that. And then we meet each other back at 3 o'clock sharp. Have a good lunch and have a good meeting.